given us for the party last night, for Will and for Helen and their upcoming nuptials. Lord, bless us in this study this morning as we seek to understand the world that we live in, that we can give a proper apologetic, a proper response to it, proclaiming the truth of your word and what you teach us that what we are as human beings, what our purpose is in this world, and what the path to true flourishing looks like. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, I thought about skipping it. I'm going to finish the last lesson before we go on to chapter 6 proper. The final point of the last lesson being the revolt of the elites, the changing function of social elites within today's world versus years past. So, of course, there's always been elites within society, various classes, typically rich people, nobility, the priestly clergy class, and people like that. But historically, the role of the elites, and this would have been seen as obvious, and this would have been talked about as their job. Historically, the role of the elites was to transmit the values of the current generation, or even the previous generation, to the next generation. That we are reproducing society as it is, with its social values. We want things to continue. There's a certain level of conservatism assumed in all of it. Religious authorities passed on the faith. National leaders encouraged patriotism. And the family cultivated respect for parents and grandparents. And in addition, they would cultivate respect for the other authorities within the social structure. In education, teachers sought to draw on the wisdom of the past in order to form people to be productive members of society. Why else would you have education? The role of the elites was to promote a vision of the self that had obligations to others and an obligation to the past. That we're all in this together to a certain extent. The modern elites do just the opposite to that. Truman writes that the fields of politics, art, education, and corporate business are now all marked by an aggressive negativity towards the past and its values and beliefs. The political drive on the left to overthrow traditional notions of sexual morality and human identity, and that on the populist right, with its rhetoric of contempt for traditional democratic institutions, both witness to a deep commitment to tearing down the values of the past. Burn the past to the ground is the underlying mantra of political radicals on both sides. As we've already discussed in this series, education, modern education, is permeated with the politics of identity and or the critical theories that underpin the politics of identity. So often, even if it doesn't take a sexual direction like what we're seeing in a lot of public schools today, those same theories that drive that in terms of the expressive individualism, that education has become a performance, we see that across the spectrum now. Even if it doesn't take an explicitly sexual turn. The modern teacher sees the purpose of education to be that of oftentimes unmasking social inequalities and the pursuit of social justice. It's not about forming the individual to take part in society. It's a little bit more radical than that. Rousseau's theory that culture is necessarily corrupting and oppressive is being applied to an ever-increasing list of topics. The Romans in various culture, the Romans just, Latin's fun. So, the Romans would say mas maiorum, the ancient way, or the way of the ancestors today, and that's the emphasis on everything they're doing. But, and so the Romans, in terms of how that governed their policies, for instance, when it came to something like Judaism, now, the Romans were kind of frowned upon Judaism because it's monotheistic. These people aren't willing to sacrifice to the emperor. But they give the Jews a pass because as much as they didn't like this whole monotheistic thing, what the Romans appreciated about Judaism was it was old. That this was an ancestral religion. These people could remember their genealogies back to Mount Sinai. And even before that, they could trace their ancestry back to Adam. And so the Romans at least said, these Jews at least are holding to ancestral customs. And we as Romans who believe in holding to ancestral customs can respect that. They follow the Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors. Today, the Mores Maiorum, the ways of the ancestors. So we say we have mores and customs. So mores are ways. The mores, the ways of the ancestor, are increasingly decried as colonialist, sexist, imperialist, and racist. So if it's old, it must be bad. There's nothing our ancestors did that was good or commendable in the slightest. It's all corrupt. We know better than these people. All of our ancestors were idiots in every aspect of what they taught and believed. That's the complete opposite of how. Now again, it's not. Even the Romans may have looked at a few things their ancestors did, and they would have said that's a little off. For instance, in the Republic period, when Cicero's writing, he says, well, our ancestors used to have a king, and we don't like kings anymore. We've established a better form of government in the Republic. And so you do see some improvement, but the vast majority of what they looked on, even they're looking back on the past at somebody like Romulus, Remus and Romulus, they're going to have a positive view because they're older. These are our forefathers, and we have some obligation to them, even if we disagree with some of what they taught and believed. No longer today. Truman talks about the battle over what books are assigned in curriculums. And again, I think a lot of conservatives have the idea that this is a leftist problem, the battle over books and curriculum. It's these woke people that want to ban books. It's a problem across the spectrum, and I have a wonderful illustration of this. Earlier this year, the spring, I think it was January of 2026, Texas A&M's Conservative Board of Regents banned Plato in the philosophy department. I'll repeat that. Texas A&M's Conservative Board of Regents banned Plato. Why? Because Plato, the father of Western philosophy, one of the giants of Western civilization, whose categories have been employed by a variety of theologians from the apostles to Aquinas, this same Plato wrote about gender, and that makes Plato woke. So we're banning Plato in the philosophy department at Texas A&M. Conservative boards across the country for all sorts of different levels of education are passing unilateral bans on any writings with sexual content. And you might be thinking, that's wonderful. There shouldn't be any writings with sexual content in the schools. And I just want we're going to stop and think about this for a second. Well, what might be the problem with passing a unilateral ban on anything sexual at a grade school level? What sort of books get thrown out if you do that? Just unilaterally, nothing even remotely sexual is going to be talked about in high school.
You said, which school, which age group?
Grade school. Let's just limit this to, let's say, middle school and high school.
So 7th through 12th?
Yeah. So anything, if we're going to ban any books that have anything remotely sexual in them.
The Bible.
Oh, the Bible. Okay, and so all of a sudden these conservative school boards, they pass bans on anything with sex, and the Bible gets pulled out of the library, and then people get shocked. Why are you pulling out the Bible? It's like, have you ever read the Bible? I mean, let's forget about, everybody has Hosea, hopefully has Hosea on the mind right now. But you have sexual content almost from the get-go. Genesis is full of it. Fairly graphic stuff from Sodom and Gomorrah to the affair with Hagar and Jacob's 4 wives and all of that. You have one of the books of the Bible, Song of Songs, is pretty much all about sex. When the first line of the song is, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your lovemaking is better than wine, it sort of keys you off to what the song is about, even though that's not translated appropriate. Song of Songs is intentionally not translated appropriately because they didn't want to offend the English-speaking audience. You think of Proverbs, it's full of all sorts of advice about sex and sexual fidelity as opposed to unfaithfulness. You get other books that are banned. Shakespeare, full of innuendo, and that's when the Westminster Confession, it talks about stage plays, and Christians shouldn't watch stage plays. They're aiming at Shakespeare. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with the Westminster divines on that point, but the Westminster divines are reading Shakespeare, and they said this is really inappropriate stuff. And it's just chock full of it, even though it's using older language to describe it. You know, I recently had a local private school teacher tell me, and this is somebody who's teaching at a high school level. You know, what does that get us? 14 years and up. You know, that he would tell me that he would have these mamas come in complaining to him, sending him angry emails or coming into the office to complain about them because he had assigned books with inappropriate material. Books like Shakespeare. Books that have been considered staples of the curriculum for at least the past 2 centuries in terms of American English education. And he told me, he says, I always wanted, you can't do this because you get in a lot of trouble. He says, I would always want to respond to these mamas with, have you ever read the Bible? Like, are you kidding me? You think it's problematic that your 16-year-old reads in a book, they spent the night together? Or they read the word prostitute in Victor Hugo's Les Mis. Again, and the Bible talks plainly about topics from rape, incest, and sodomy. The sex education of minors is an area of acrimonious debate, and this gets a little bit more understandable perhaps, but it's not just things like should we teach the middle schoolers about safe sex, and we could have all sorts of debates around that topic, but it also includes things like, can the biology teacher talk about sexual reproduction in the context of the biology class? Is it appropriate for the high school biology teacher to display diagrams of the reproductive system? The same parents who give their children unlimited access to pornography complain when their teenager's teacher shows a diagram of the uterus. God forbid they know what ovaries are, that their innocence is permanently shattered if they know where that they've seen the fallopian tubes now. That this is where we're at as a society. And the same parents that make such complaints often allow their teenagers almost limitless access to modern media full of all sorts of just crap and all sorts of graphic things. But you know, they're talking about in high school in the context of the biology class, then it's a problem all of a sudden. Actors, singers, and movie stars are the cultural elites in our day, and that's really, really strange in the history of the world. I just think, last week, perhaps some of you are familiar with the children's YouTube content creator, Miss Rachel. Perhaps your children watch Miss Rachel. Last week, she feels the need to post about the Nolan Wells, the stuff that's going on in the Mississippi coast. And what she does is she suggests that the investigation is being mishandled because Nolan Wells is black. Again, she doesn't have any skin in the race. She doesn't know anything. Again, the assumption is that we white Mississippians are just inherently racist. That's a very critical view of the world and of white people. It's actually a racist view, to be honest. But anyways, actors weigh in authoritatively on issues ranging from healthcare to nuclear energy policies. Hundreds of millions of people in this country consider their opinions, the opinion of a movie star, to be weighty on issues like this. But the far weightier impact they have is in the direct content they produce. Their shows, movies, and songs promote the ideology of the sexual revolution, and they mock people who think maybe we shouldn't be talking about like this, maybe we shouldn't be thinking about sex in these categories. If you were to say, we shouldn't be promoting this sort of licentious lifestyle of just sleeping around, well, you're just a hateful prude, is the response. So Truman writes, as to music, we have come a long way from the moment in the 1960s when the Rolling Stones had to change the lyrics of the song, "Let's Spend the Night Together," to "Let's Spend Some Time Together," in order to be allowed to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. Songs marketed to young teenage girls now routinely contain sexually explicit lyrics far beyond anything Mick Jagger ever recorded, and often accompanied by videos that flaunt the singer's sexuality in graphic ways. Okay, so then Truman talks about the impact of modern big business. Traditionally, big business has been identified with conservatism because, the way these companies made all this money was through capitalism. And traditional leftism is very opposed to capitalism. You know, if the leftists win, big business goes out of big business. That's what always happens, or it's taken over by the state. But today, massive corporations are throwing their weight behind a range of leftist causes, which is bizarre. The most visible way they're doing this is changing their logos at Pride Month, though in the last couple of years that's gone down a lot. Perhaps we're seeing a social backlash. I tend to think if we get a Democrat in office as president next, all the rainbow logos will come back. We'll see. I hope they don't, but you know that's that tends to be my thought process in all of this. It just depends on who's in office they're pandering to at the moment. I have a friend. He works at a plant for a major corporation that manufactures equipment for the military. Really big company. Last year, they wanted all their employees at the various plant locations. Okay, everybody at this plant is going to show up wearing green. Everybody at this plant is going to show up wearing blue, yellow. And they were going to do a big montage, a rainbow montage of all these engineers and factory workers just for Pride Month. When only 2 employees at his plant showed up wearing the requested colors, they gave up on that idea. But I just want you to think about what would have happened if he and only one of his coworkers were the only ones who didn't show up wearing the asked for color. You know, he very well could have been fired or disciplined or retaliated against in some professional way. Thankfully for him, everybody else had the same mindset, not just his plant, across all of them. People are fed up with this and don't care about the agenda the company's pushing. And so because all the employees are against it, the company backs off. But it could have easily been the opposite case. Anytime a legislature seeks to ban biological men from using women's bathrooms, big business swoops in and threatens, we're going to pull out all of our factories, we're going to pull out all of our offices, and we're going to retaliate against you economically if you don't let men go into the women's bathroom or the bathroom of their choice.
So if your friend had been the only one that didn't participate and it cost them their job, what would you say to that?
I would say it's worth it. You have to take a stand at some point, and so that's going to be costly. Again, I get it. People need their paycheck. People have to make, and a lot of this, it's very, there's so much pressure. There's threatening involved, implicit threats involved. And so I understand why people might fold because they need to keep their family, they need to feed their family. But I think it would have been worth it for him to lose his job. And again, thankfully, only 2 people at the plant of hundreds of people showed up wearing the colors. So that's not what happened. But it very well could have. But at every turn, the cultural elites are seeking to overthrow the old ways to replace them with new values in line with the ideology of the expressive individual, and the masses are eating it all up, and people are voluntarily paying money to consume the products these people are throwing out. And so, think, Target's transgender stuff a couple of years ago. Well, everybody stops, going to Target for, a month? 2 months, very quickly, all of a sudden, all the wives, miss Target, and so you have to start going back to Target after a while and forget about why you were stopping. Bud Light, I wasn't drinking Bud Light to begin with, but what did that last? Most people had strong convictions about Bud Light because of their transgender ad campaign for about a year. And then they forget about it. But it's not just Bud Light and Target, or Anheuser-Busch and Target. It's all these major companies and corporations.
Now, Target did the next Pride Month was not at all as in your face. I mean, I think it had an effect. It could have been the political stuff going on too.
So boycotts can work. But again, they haven't fundamentally. It's not as much in your face because there's an economic response.
Spotify, I haven't seen in 2 years. They used to just put it all in your face on the homepage. I haven't seen that in a while.
Yeah. So it was far. Thankfully, this past June, it was far less.
They didn't have a way to say I'm not interested in that.
Okay. My question is, if we have a Democrat in office next, is it all going to go back? I'm really, I'm hoping it's not. I'm tend to think about half the companies will start doing it again, and some of them will stand their grounds. But we'll see. It's going to be interesting. How much does it all depend on who's in office and who's being pandered to? But that brings us to chapter 6. Thus far, Truman has given us an overview of the major aspects of the modern self. We've talked a lot about the authority of inner feelings, how those have become central to identity, and the real problem with that is now these authoritative feelings are now sexualized by people like Freud, and how these sexualized inner feelings have become politicized. So it's a long and drawn-out process to how we've gotten here, step by step. We've talked about how technological factors have made these shifts and understanding seem plausible, because it looks like we can reshape the body now because we have things like hormone treatments. All of a sudden, things like transgender ideology seems plausible, whereas 100 years ago, that would have seemed absolutely absurd. Or things like uninhibited teenage sex would have been absurd 100 years ago, but because of birth control today, this now seems like a plausible option. In this chapter, Truman will discuss the nature of personhood, the politics of recognition, and the power of imagined communities. Truman writes, "Our culture is one marked by plastic people who believe they can make and remake themselves at will, and by a liquid world in which, to borrow a phrase from Karl Marx, all that is solid seems continually to melt in the air. The coincidence of these two things, or the coincidence of these two things, plastic people and a liquid world, is central to the issues we now face in our culture, from identity politics and LGBTQ plus rights to the growing impatience in some quarters with traditional freedoms, such as those of speech and religion." So that brings us to the first point of chapter 6. What is a person? And even that question, perhaps to some of you in here, and if you ask that question to a lot of your neighbors, that question might seem so obvious to you that it's absurd that I'm even asking, or Truman is even asking the question. But it's not as obvious as it may first appear, and just humor me for a second. So if you had asked that same question, or let's slightly reformulate the question. If you had asked the Southern Presbyterian theologian Robert Louis Dabney, he was the great chaplain and aide-de-camp to Stonewall Jackson. If you've read the Bible, he said something far more derogatory. He said that on the floor of General Assembly. Okay, and he would have thought that was an obvious, and he would have talked about all these liberals up north at Princeton, like B.B. Warfield, and these people are crazy because they think that blacks are human beings that have souls and should be evangelized to. Dabney would have thought that was absurd, and again, he's appealing to Darwin. Dabney is a Darwinist. He says this is what the science teaches us. And again, you go back and read Darwin's Origins of Species. Charles Darwin was a vilely racist individual. And he's using science to justify his racism. If you had asked the Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero, are slaves persons? Cicero would have responded, of course slaves are not persons. Slaves are property. They have no rights under the law. And as property, you can do with them whatever you please. And that would have seemed obvious to Cicero. It would be absurd to question otherwise for him. The vast majority of people in his world, of course, slaves are not people. That's why what the Apostle Paul writes to Philemon is so extraordinary and countercultural, and we don't even bat an eye at it today. But that would have been monumental in the Greco-Roman world. If you ask practically any Democrat in Congress today, is the 8-month-old fetus in the womb a person? The response is going to be something like, well, you're showing your privilege and your inherent racism by even asking the question, and of course an 8-month-old fetus is not a person, it's just a clump of cells. They're all going to answer in some form like that, and at least behind closed doors, at least some of those same congressmen might admit to you that old people with dementia are not persons either, that they're just clumps of cells like the 8-month-old fetus. Really they're using resources that could be given to transgender teens and Somali daycares. These evil people, old people with dementia, are just drains on the system that we could be giving to the Somali daycares. So how? Yes, sir.
Just commenting on how the perspective on personhood changed. Back to C. Lauren Brace's book, Just and Christie, explains that Christianity emphasized that women are persons and have rights, that slaves are persons and have rights, and that babies are persons and have rights, none of which were recognized in Rome. And it was an intentional and focused development that changed attitudes and laws. And as Christianity became more and more prominent and more involved in society and government.
Yeah, when I was reading, when I was preparing to preach Philemon, one of the commentators, made the statement. I think they're right. Paul single-handedly creates, or at least gives the West the modern concept of personhood. In his letter to, the 20 verses or so he writes to Philemon, that has a monumental shift on the world we live in today. And again, we take it for granted. Again, we think this is obvious, that this is not up for debate, that people have not always thought this. Now, again, Christians have been, at least Orthodox, let's forget Dabney for a second. We've been talking in these terms for 2,000 years now. But even, it has not been obvious to everybody in society, even within the last 200 years in America, it has not been an obvious question to a lot of people. But it is a Christian position on personhood, and you sort of get it. Of course, the vast majority of my citations come from my Logos library, and so that's going to tend to lean heavily Christian, Orthodox Christian. The middle definition here. Well, it happens to be written by the same person who wrote the above definition. That gives you sort of a fairly secular definition. You don't see appeals to God and the image of God in that. But when Christians talk about what a human being is, a human being is made in the image of God. That a person, that we have divine persons, and that our personhood conceptually has a relationship to the personhood of God, that we have a tri-personal God, three distinct persons within the Trinity that are somehow unified. We would call that a mystery. But we have a personhood, individuality in that sense, related to God because we're made in His image, that angels are persons too. We define personality relationally in terms of other people and other things, and particularly God. But if you don't have that, and we have a really good description and definition and arguments that can be made that go way beyond these definitions as to what people are. But if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the Christian God, you're just floating around and making it up as you go what people are. It is not obvious what a human being is. If Darwin is right, then none of us are people. All we are are clumps of cells operating on the basis of hormonal and chemical processes that are random. We just do what we do, not because we have minds, but because we're just driven entirely by biology. It's just an automatic process. There's nothing transcendent or transcendental going on. We're just clumps of cells that do what we do. There's no moral value to things like that. A bucket of chemicals does not have moral status or rights. That's entirely made up at this point if you reject Christianity, or at least a transcendent religion with transcendent values. How do you define what makes you you? We could, like I said, define ourselves by our chemical makeup. You're all mostly made out of water, and the rest of the vast majority of what's left is a series of complex hydrocarbons. So you're made of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and that's pretty much it. You're made out of three things. Then less than 1% of 1% of you is made out of other trace elements. So you got a little iron in there. A few other things that are rather unique. You got a little bit of nitrogen here and there for some unique molecules. Okay, so if somebody's asking, who are you? You're not going to answer, well, I'm made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's not useful. We could define ourselves by our genetic code. You all have a unique genetic code. But if I'm just looking at stacks of printouts, you know, all of your genomes can be entirely sequenced. You could print it out on paper. If I'm just looking at stacks of printouts containing sequenced genomes of individuals, that doesn't practically give me a whole lot about them. Maybe I know that they have a proclivity to certain diseases or cancers or things like that. The biggest difference that I could see in half the printouts is that half the printouts have a Y chromosome, whereas the other half doesn't. That's going to be the starkest difference between all of them. The vast majority of everything else is going to be almost identical, with less than 1% being functionally different. Truman writes, to be a person is to be something more. It is to be someone with a particular history. To ask who I am is not to demand to know what makes me biologically distinct from other human beings, but to ask about my life, about the people, places, actions, and events that have shaped my sense of identity. So if you, let's say, think of all these sci-fi and time traveling shows that people watch. If you, with your exact genetic code, had been born in 1770s France, you would be a completely different person, even though genetically you'd be identical, let's say for the sake of argument. But if you grew up in 1770s France, you had the same body, the same makeup and everything, you would be a radically different person. We are, to a large degree, constituted according to our social relationships and how our interactions with our peers, our family, and our environment shape us over time. Our identities can be shaped over time. Most of you would probably say you're not the same person you were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. You certainly aren't the same person you were as a 10-year-old, right? You can change your social relationships to a degree. You can make free choices. Truman writes, freedom and intentionality characterize my life. So is my identity not a matter of me deciding to be this kind of person and not that? Okay, we all think I can make free choices. I can sort of define myself. I can, if I don't like my family, I can cut them off. If I don't like my friends, I can cut them off. I can make new ones. I can change my circumstances, and I can just sort of mold my identity. That's how people think now. But of course, I have freedom to do these things. But of course, our freedom and intentionality, it's not as free and intentional as it first appears. And people get really upset when you start talking in this way, because how dare you question my free choice? Of course, I'm making free and unimpeded choices, but that's not true. Our decision-making process is influenced by our environment and a whole other bunch of factors as well, with various factors from outside and within having both conscious and unconscious effect on the choices we make. So Truman gives this wonderful example of the typical teenager. Truman writes, there is no person more prone to emphasize independence and freedom than a teenager wanting to assert their emerging adulthood by breaking free of the constraints placed upon them by parents. Often this manifests itself in choice of clothing. Fashion is now frequently designed to be a deliberate and conscious, often iconoclastic contrast with that which preceded it, and therefore to mark off the rising generation from the previous ones. On occasion, it can be very specifically intended to represent a form of positive rebellion. The arrival of blue jeans in the 1950s and of miniskirts in the 1960s are two obvious examples. But every generation has its own sartorial idioms for expressing its freedom and distinctiveness. Yet this choice of clothing, while intended as a display of individuality and independence, often leads teenagers to adopt a remarkably conformist appearance. In short, teenagers frequently all look, dress, and talk like each other. Okay, I'm doing this because I want to break the mold. I'm going to be free from the traditions of society, and they all show up to school wearing the exact same outfit. So, your teenage girl, school starting this week or last week or next week, your teenage girl wants to assert her independence and escape the herd mentality by rebelling against traditional fashion choices. And the choices she makes end up looking like the choices of the other 15 girls in her class. They all walk into school the first day of class with their Owala water bottles to assert their uniqueness, right? They all have the same style of Kinder Scott necklaces. And the other outfits and accessories they rotate through all share remarkable similarities with the girls around them. even though they think they're being free and independent. Their free and intentional decisions end up looking a lot like herd mentality, because it is. And then they're going to indignantly respond to you, well, my Owala water bottle is a different color than Susie's. So it's completely different, right? And they're going to think that's profound. You see this especially, there's been all sorts of stuff. It's really, again, where there's psychological differences between boys and girls. Hopefully that's obvious. But with teen girls in particular, this comes to be a problem with mass psychosis in friend groups. One girl develops an eating disorder, and what happens is, she's trying to get back at mommy and daddy for something, and all the other girls in the friend group develop eating disorders to exert their independence, but they're all doing it in solidarity. So on psych wards in the hospitals, they have to break the teenage girls up because they'll all encourage one another and reinforce one another in their eating disorders. This is a major problem that's shown up in the last 20 years. And this has never been observed before or seen. This is really new. One girl decides she's actually transgender, and all the girls in the friend group decide they're transgender in solidarity. They're all exerting their independence, but and their free choice. But it's, again, this is groupthink and a herd mentality. Their choice is not as free as they think it is. Truman writes that this highlights the fact that human beings do not simply wish to be free, we also wish to belong, to be part of a group where we are accepted and affirmed. We are social creatures and thrive best in situations where we are connected to others and have a sense of communal identity. The terms of belonging to any group or community is grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. Are not things that we as individuals invent, but that are constituted by the society in which we find ourselves, of which we desire to be a part, and by which we want to be recognized. The teenager who wants to express her freedom does so by wearing the uniform of the group to which she belongs. She may well be rebelling against the norms set by her parents, but she is conforming to a framework established by those with whom she wishes to identify. The same is true of society as a whole. We may be intuitively free and intentional in our actions, but we also wish to belong to a group or groups that make us feel value. This leads us to the politics of recognition. How much time do we have left? 15 minutes? And oftentimes, when people talk about, models of education, do you homeschool or do you send them to a corporate model where we're all packing them into the same age groups together? The argument for packing them into the classroom, you have 15 other people that are also 13-year-olds, we're doing this to socialize them. Well, if what Truman just said is correct about, basic human psychology and how we function, you're socializing them to behave like the other 15, 13-year-olds in the classroom. And the problem with that is if the other 15, 13-year-olds in the classroom behave like chimpanzees, then the result is you socialized your 13-year-old to behave like a chimpanzee. And oftentimes, because of the complete collapse of discipline within schools, it's just outrageous, this notion that you could discipline a child. Let's forget corporeal discipline for a second. But just this idea we shouldn't discipline them at all, that makes the problem a lot worse. We just have this Marxist Freudianism that pervades all of corporate education today. And again, a lot of modern parenting also assumes it. Education has become about expressing oneself. It's become about performance. And so now you've put your child in, oftentimes, not exclusively, not all schools are equal, but you might be putting them into a class where the 13 other students are all about performing and expressing themselves, and that's what your child is probably going to end up doing as well, because that's what human beings do. We try to conform with our peers. We want to belong. We all want this. But anyway, so the politics of recognition. We discussed, this is point 2, we discussed the liberal concept of recognition in Chapter 4. The liberal concept is different from that of the straightforward notion. For instance, I can recognize that Juan claims to be gay. I know a lot. I happen to know a fair bit of people who tell me that they're gay. Okay, it's not absurd for me to say, okay, you say you're gay. I get that. I don't agree with that. I have all sorts of philosophical and religious problems with that, but I understand that you're telling me that you're gay. I believe that is exactly what you think. That is not what is meant by recognition anymore. For the liberals, to recognize means that I affirm that one is gay, and I approve of his self-conception. Now think about an experience regarding recognition that probably most of the people in this room have experienced in one form or another. You're back in elementary school or middle school, maybe high school. You're on the playground or rec center or out in the field with the other children, and y'all decide to play kickball. Okay, or something like that, dodgeball, maybe pick up soccer or basketball. 2 team captains are chosen. They're generally pretty obvious, right? And the 2 team captains start picking players one by one. The players that get picked first are recognized as being the best at the particular sport that's being played, whereas the players that get picked last, they're recognized as being the worst or not worthy. For one reason or another. The child that gets picked first feels elated, whereas the child that gets picked last gets dejected or feels dejected. I have to wonder, perhaps some of your children have never experienced something like that. The reason being because if modern mamas or school administrators looked out into the yard and saw the kids picking teams like that, they might rush in to intervene to stop it, because given the Marxist Freudian worldview which they possess, we can't allow or do anything that might harm the child's self-esteem, because this might make little Johnny feel bad. We can't do it like this. So the mama or the administrator goes in and picks the teams randomly. As a result, the modern dogma is that children, whether 7 or 17, must be kept in emotional bubbles to protect their feelings at all costs. And of course, this dogma has produced the most neurotically ill-adjusted young adults the world has ever seen, that have all sorts of problems as a result of this coddling. To use Marx's language, such a process of picking teammates precipitates a feeling of alienation. You get picked last, you feel alienated. The child who is picked last has not been recognized, and his value for kickball has not been affirmed. But of course, we've moved beyond protecting the emotions of 7-year-olds at all costs to defending the emotions of anyone at all costs and for any reason whatsoever. We must protect little Johnny from the alienation of not being recognized as a good kickball player. And we must protect the 25-year-old little Johnny from the alienation of not being affirmed as openly gay in this lifestyle that he's constantly posting on Facebook about. If you don't like his post, then you're clearly a hateful bigot that is not choosing to support him in like manner to how you didn't choose to pick him for your kickball team. It's the same thought process, which brings us to point 3, imagine communities. Truman writes, in an influential book, Imagine Communities, the political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson argued that the idea of the nation-state involved an imagined community. Nations, almost by definition, involve so vast an area of geographical space, such large populations, and so many individual communities, villages, towns, cities, that it is impossible for everyone to know everyone else. This means that for a nation to exist, its members must imagine that they hold things in common that give them a coherent identity as a body of people. The trucker in Seattle must identify at some deep level with the restaurant owner in Florida if the idea of America is to make sense. So what binds this kind of community together is a shared narrative that gives the citizens a shared history, or at least the people living in the country a shared history, a sense of belonging and a sense of pride. So we have rituals that go along with these narratives, like pledging allegiance, or standing up for the national anthem, singing the national anthem, and other patriotic songs, and celebrating national holidays. These rituals reinforce the narrative and help us to have a sense of belonging. And so that's why these things have been so heavily promoted throughout the centuries, because the state is very concerned with the people having a sense of belonging. The reason being, so if a place in the country is attacked, for instance, a far-flung place like Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor is attacked, was it December? I should know the date, but anyways, when Pearl Harbor is attacked, probably most Americans have never heard of Hawaii. Now, some of them have. There's a major, my great-grandfather was at Pearl Harbor from South Alabama. So, there's probably people that are aware of it because there's a major military base. But, it's very important for, FDR that Americans feel like Hawaii is one of, the people of Hawaii are one of us. That an attack on Hawaii is the equivalent of an attack on the mainland, because that is American soil. Okay, so it's very useful that we all have a sense of corporate belonging, so people, volunteer to join the Army, and people don't get upset when they're being enlisted into the Army, and things like that. People feel like they have skin in the game, and so they need to go fight the Japanese, they need to go fight the Nazis. It is interesting, when FDR is writing his speech in response to in response to Pearl Harbor, it's not just Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked the entire, Pacific theater, particularly on the Philippines. Remember, we owned the Philippines for quite a while. That's American territory too. So in the original draft, he talks about the attack on the Philippines and Hawaii, but he takes the Philippines out because the concern is isolationist Americans are upset by the fact that we're in the Philippines to begin with. There's also some racially driven concerns there that people don't feel like they have ownership in the Philippines, that these people are not one of us, and so he takes that out. He thinks that'd be stretching the national imagination too far if we're stretching it all the way out into the Philippines, even though people like Douglas MacArthur are probably vehemently opposing the removal of the Philippines from the speech. But anyways, Truman writes, in short, even though a few of them actually knew each other in their real in short, even though a few of them actually knew each other in their real daily lives, they still saw themselves as all belonging to a community whose cause they saw as greater than themselves. That, we might note, is true belonging, and it is rooted in the imagination. That does not mean this sense of belonging is imaginary, in the sense of not being true or not really existing, but it does mean that it is rooted in a way of thinking and not in the fact of personal acquaintance with every other member of the community. But today, the national narratives of the sort that catalyze the American populace, that we all feel like we have ownership when we're attacked, so we need to go to war and we all need to personally volunteer to help with the effort. The sort of national narratives that provided that coherence, the sort of rituals that help reinforce that sense of belonging in America, they're under attack. It's not just here, it's everywhere. At least a lot of countries. You still have plenty of very nationalistic and patriotic societies. Because that's important for the state, especially if you're planning on invading your neighbors or defending yourself from being invaded by your neighbor. The various aspects of civic life that once helped to reinforce responsible civic participation, whether nation, religion, or family, and all of these things, 100 years ago, all of these aspects of life would have been reinforcing civic participation. All of these things are now viewed with suspicion and disdain. Alternative narratives have arisen, and alternate institutions and communities have arisen to compete with traditional communities like nation, church, and family. And while there's always been alternate communities, there were alternate communities in the ancient Roman world. So the Romans would call these things heresies, sects. And they look down upon them because these are very new. They're not following the way of the ancestors. So they look down on Christianity for that reason, because Christianity is new. This is a new imagined community, and this potentially might threaten the traditional communities of the state apparatus. These sort of communities have always existed, but they used to be on the fringes for the most part. They weren't integrated into the public square. Whereas today they have been. They're out in the open, and they're very popular in a way that they traditionally would not have been. Why has this occurred? Well, Truman has argued that we have the internet to thank for this. On April 27th, in 2019, a man entered Chabad Synagogue and shot 4 people, killing one of them. The shooter was a 19-year-old member of Escondido Orthodox Presbyterian Church, where Westminster Seminary is, or Westminster West. Why did a member of an OPC church decide that he was going to shoot up a synagogue? Well, like most other teenagers, his parents gave him unfettered access to evil via his smartphone and other devices. He apparently spent his time watching white supremacist and neo-Nazi content. He found his way into white nationalist forums on the internet, and he came to feel he belonged to the imagined community of oppressed white people. And that's about as imaginary a community as one can possibly imagine. And of course, the Jews are the ones to blame for the oppressed status of white people in America. George Soros controls everything from the weather to the space lasers, and George Soros controls the fates and social conditions of the oppressed white people. Okay, that's now the very imaginary community that this 19-year-old, probably around the time he was 17, felt he had membership in. This 19-year-old, he never once attended a meeting of the KKK. He never once attended a neo-Nazi meeting or any other white supremacist group. His imagined community was entirely online. And he felt that was more real to him, his community of imaginary oppressed white people, that was more real to him than the communities of his family, his church, and his nation. So as it turns out, propaganda works. If you let your children have unfettered access to evil, you shouldn't be surprised to find out they've utilized that unfettered access to evil. You as the parent, let's say, think Moses tells you you're supposed to be teaching them the ways of the law as you're walking down the road. Okay, maybe you do that. Maybe y'all are talking about moral issues on the car ride home. Let's say you're directly talking about moral issues with your kids, maybe an hour a week, give or take. This is what God teaches us. This is the eighth commandment, the ninth commandment. This is what God requires of us. Okay, you're having maybe conversations like that an hour a week, but your teenager, that doesn't even come close to the dozens of hours they're spending every week watching all sorts of unimaginably gross content on their smartphones. In terms of what the average American teenager, including the average American Christian teenager, is consuming on his phone, everything from pornography to neo-Nazi content. It's all out there. It's all easily accessible. You could all Google it right now and find it within the next 5 seconds. I think most parents, frankly, are more than content to allow their children to watch unlimited pornography on their smartphone, because at the end of the day, they really don't believe it's truly harming anything, even though that's not true in the slightest. Depression and sexual dysfunction are very real issues that pornography statistically causes at a very, very high rate, especially for teenagers. Most of those parents would never imagine the possibility that it's not porn their teenagers are watching, rather it's neo-Nazi content on the internet. But that is a very, very real possibility. If that happens to a teenager at a very nice OPC church out in California, it's just as likely to happen here at Emmanuel CREC. Okay? This stuff is out there, and people really do, they get hooked on it. They stumble across one video, one short on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, and they think this is interesting. And it may not start, just completely openly, as complete openly and vile racism. They get you hooked in. The algorithm is picking up on what's interesting you. And then it gets more and more, the algorithm feeds you more and more radical content, and they realize this is getting your attention, and it's a feedback loop. They're giving you more and more graphic or more and more extreme content. You've gone from a world that only had a few television channels and a few nationally distributed magazines and newspapers to a world that has endless content at your fingertips, communicating an endless variety of narratives different from your own. And all these content creators are doing their very best to get your attention and to get you hooked into their community on the internet. As modern people now shop for the church that fits all their particular boxes, from music styles to amenities, so too can people shop for content creators that spew exactly what they want to hear. And again, the algorithm is picking up on what you want to hear, and it's giving you feedback and giving you curating stuff that's like that and more extreme. Of course, this started long before the internet. Truman writes there's a black community, the LGBT community, the Asian community, the disabled community, even the BDSM, bondage, discipline, dominance, and submission, sadomasochism community. The use of the word communities for these various groups indicates both the collapse of traditional notions of belonging and the rise of a vast and growing number of alternative ways of human beings imagining their relationship to those around them. When identity is grounded in psychology, and the internet allows for the indulgence of any and all means of thinking about that identity, the concept of community lacks any real solidity. People can now pick and choose their communities, and that means they can pick and choose their identities. But now we have these communities that are often entirely online. Again, there's been a black community for decades, if not centuries, depending on how you define that. And I'm sure scholars spend lots of time debating that and how it works. But we have these communities that are now entirely online. You see headlines like, he pledged his allegiance to ISIS on the internet. What does that even mean, to pledge allegiance on the internet? Some of you might remember, I remember this because I was there. In 2015, a young couple at Mississippi State, these two kids were dating, that they decided they were going to fly to Syria and join ISIS. Does anybody remember this? Vaguely. This, and of course, they're members of the local mosque. But anyways, they came to feel part of the community of ISIS because they found ISIS content about establishing the Islamic Caliphate on the internet. And they were just enamored by this. And they just thought this was the greatest stuff they've ever seen. This is the greatest movement the world has ever seen. And they wanted to be part of it, even though they had never met a member of ISIS in their life, at least in the real world. Whereas in the past, to be able to form a community, you needed to be geographically near to like-minded individuals. Truman talks about, one of the frustrations of the Marxist politicians and the Marxist advocates in the 19th century was, that they couldn't get people in far-flung countries like England. They couldn't get them to conceive of themselves in terms of class membership instead of membership in England, or membership of particular families, or memberships of churches. That they can understand why do these people think their membership in the Anglican Church is more important than their membership in the working class. That just perplexed Marx and his colleagues. And part of it was they're so far away from everything. It's hard to feel like you have membership if you're completely disconnected geographically. But the internet has changed that. I now can feel like I have membership and association with people I've never met. People that might be half a world away or an entire world away. I feel like I have a close connection to them. At the end of the day, I can, I can hop into a Discord server with all my friends from college, and we can talk like we're in the same room about whatever we want. If we feel like we're right next to one another, that we're present with one another, even though they're all hours away. And that to a certain degree feels real, even if it's not, or even if it's different than previous forms of community. The internet bridges the gap between vast distances to make people feel like they are close to one another, even if they never physically interact with anyone else in their online community. So think about churches. I know, give me 4 minutes. I'm sorry, we're over time. But think about churches. The new normal for preachers. I've talked to people about this. Of course, I've read articles about this too. But I've seen this. A new normal for preachers is that they have a friend that doesn't go to their church, and the friend says to them, "Hey, I just met a guy named Johnny who says he's been going to your church for 10 years." Okay, and I think to myself, I have no idea who Johnny is. I've never seen Johnny in church ever. Again, these are the sort of, I talk to local pastors, this is the sort of stuff they tell me. But I go and look, the pastor, the preacher goes and looks at the membership rolls, and sure enough, Johnny has indeed been a member there for the last 10 years. Was Johnny lying to my friend when he says he's been going to my church for the last 10 years? Well, Johnny doesn't think he was telling a fib because he's been watching the live stream. And in his mind, that's the exact same thing as physically going into the church as a member of the church. What's the sort of problem with that sort of idea of membership in a community, a church community or otherwise? Is watching the live stream, never walking to this building, watching the live stream for the last 10 years, is that the same thing as what you're doing right now?
Yeah, because we're body and soul.
We're body and soul. Okay, and our bodies are fundamental to who we are, and we're going to be talking about that later. In this, we can't just change that. There's certain psychological realities that are involved with being physically present with people. It's hard, if somebody's watching the live stream and I've never met them, I have no idea what's going on in their life. I have no idea what needs they have, what concerns they have, what things that I can help. We're told to bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. Well, it's hard for me to bear somebody's burden if I've never met them and they've never been here. And that doesn't just apply to church communities. That can apply to any community that people feel like they have online membership in them. It doesn't feel, you don't have any skin in the game if it's entirely online. So now we have online communities of anti-racists that have shared narratives that seem more important than national narratives or religious narratives. After the death of George Floyd, it was probably rather predictable to most of us that there would be local protest and rioting in Minneapolis and perhaps some rioting and protest across the United States. We could all see this coming. What was surprising was that people in London were marching and holding protests about the death of George Floyd. And that's really, really strange. Again, the people in London, they don't have any skin in the game in terms of what's going on in Minneapolis. Truman thinks it's rather odd that people in London would be protesting what was going on because of George Floyd in Minneapolis, whereas there were no protests in London for the vast human rights violations that were presently and continue to go on in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was a British city up until 1997. Okay, the people living there were part of Great Britain. They were British. There is a relationship between the people in London and people of Hong Kong because of national identity. But the vast majority of British citizens don't care what's going on in Hong Kong, even though they historically do have skin in the game. According to their treaties, the treaties that were signed for the handover, they're supposed to be enforcing these people's civil rights and make sure that the Chinese government doesn't oppress them. Not that anything like that's going to ever happen. Nobody's going to intervene for the oppressed people in Hong Kong. And what's going on is participation in the imagined community or the entirely imaginary community feels like you're doing something, even though you don't have any skin in the game or bearing. And what that is doing, it's distracting you from real issues that you really could have effect on. People are obsessed with national and international politics. Well, national and international politics, at the end of the day, has very little bearing on the way that you live your life. Whereas the stuff that happens in your neighborhood, in your city, in your county, that has a lot of bearing. And you have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to that, but we all do this. We're participating in this imaginary international community where we think, oh, my protest, my comments on Facebook are going to make a difference. Well, that's not true. That's just distracting you from the issues close at home that you could be having an effect on. But anyways, so... well, we're over time. Let me go ahead and close this with prayer. You can come up to me and talk to me about any of this stuff after. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, help us to bring to remembrance this concept of order amoris, or this order of loves, that our highest obligation, the person who is my neighbor, whom I am responsible for loving and helping and caring for, is that person who is closest to me, regardless of whether they are a different religion, a different social class, or a different background entirely. That we are supposed to care about the people that are near us, people that we actually have skin in the game, and a real and viable responsibility towards. Help us to get our heads out of the clouds of imagined global communities, and to open our eyes that we might see the people that are next to us, the people that we can actually help and influence. Help us not to be influenced and conformed to this world with its myriad of stories, of accounts and narratives, but help us to focus on the narrative that you give to us in your word, the narrative of your Son who died for us, who has raised us up that we might be seated with you in the heavenly places, to help us to remember we have ownership and belonging in the heavenly kingdom, more so than the kingdoms of this world which are passing away. It is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.